rights of the poor, organizing the poor for decades, and doing really amazing work outside the system. So we connected, and then my lens just expanded much more broadly, that this wasn't simply about controlling public schools and children and families and educators, but it was really about creating systemic global poverty and then managing that. So that's sort of how I came into things. So now it's gone from poverty management to pandemic, which is creating poverty. Just keeps getting bigger.
What did you say, the weaponization of data? What do you mean by that?
Well, so Eric Schmidt, former chair, I believe, of Alphabet, Google's parent company, has said, data is the new oil. And I think that's sort of this common understanding at this point that, we're reaching peak petroleum. This next extractive resource is data. And a lot of the data in the world, increasingly as we smart up with sensors and things, our environment, and even like our phones are just a very basic sensor mechanism. Our interactions with devices, with sensors embedded in the built environment, amongst sensors, that's all generating data. And the entities that can capture and analyze that data have tremendous power. One of the things that I got into when I was working in the education front, so ultimately, when I was doing testing, I realized that wasn't the answer. That wasn't going to be, withholding the test wasn't going to be the thing to stop it, because then they moved into this technology. So the lesson I learned at that point was, like, they would like for you to do the work for them to their end. Like, you have to think a couple steps ahead, because they have like a 20 or 30-year plan. And if they can give you a little lead on a controlled opposition, even though you may not understand that that's what you're doing, like, they'll let you advance their agenda to a certain point. And so I didn't want that to happen again. And what I saw happening was there was a huge organization around data privacy, student data privacy. And while I'm very much in support of the premise of data privacy, for me, the larger philosophical context is they would like for us to ask to become digital commodities. Like, those in power would like to offer us privacy in exchange for having our life turned into data so that they can extract value from that. But it has to be a mutual agreement that we will agree to be a data commodity. And so it's sort of a false choice around data privacy, that we will get privacy, but then essentially it won't stop the educational technology. It won't stop telemedicine. It won't stop teletherapy. We'll still have to live in a digital world, but somehow we can sell ourselves as data. And so when I talk about weaponization, like, there are subtle nuances. They like to frame the argument in certain ways. And while I probably lean Luddite, at this point, a lot of the educational process that I do with people is through digital. Like, I'm not saying like it's easy to completely walk away from it, but I'm trying to say that living in a world of data is a world of sort of binary decision trees that are only a shadow of the actual world and a shadow of actual relationships. And by buying into that, we're allowing ourselves to live in their apparatus that they have constructed. Like, Google builds a really nice box. It's got a lot of bells and whistles. It's fun. It can do things. We can share stuff. But ultimately, it's Google's box. So we're not going to be able to conceive of things outside of Google's box if we decide to live there. And so these are questions. I don't tell people how to think about it, but these are the things I think about. And this data, so that's the commodification piece. The other piece is a book that was really influential for me is Yasha Levine's book, Surveillance Valley, and it's a military history of the internet. And if you understand the internet as a militarized space, it puts a very different spin on things. And if you understand that is both this intersection of the corporate state and the militarist state and sort of potentially predatory philanthropy are all operating in this digital space that feels really cool, but also has a lot of risks that people are not aware of if you don't know the historical context. And you have to consider the power and who actually, in a cloud computing world, even though we'd like to imagine it's decentralized with blockchain and different things, the people who are in control of the cloud, it's a very small number of people, mostly a lot of white guys, not exclusively, but that power is highly concentrated. And to operate in that space means to operate in their world.
You said something a minute ago that I thought was interesting. Predatory philanthropy. So you want to tell me a little bit about, like, what do you mean by predatory philanthropy?
Wealth around the world is concentrated in the hands of these billionaires, right, who are making all of this money, even under the present circumstances of the COVID situation. They all have very large philanthropic pieces. They can use those assets to influence public policies that benefit their companies as well. Additionally, so within a foundation, there's two elements to it. There's PRI and MRI. So there's the endowment money, and then there's the money that they distribute in grants. So Bill Gates, even within his philanthropy, his endowment of the Gates Foundation is invested in for-profit prisons. I mean, many very problematic things that those philanthropic monies are invested in to create these assets that then can be distributed in grants that are used to influence public policy in ways that are disproportionate to the general public. They can use these monies to put them into nonprofit institutions that are then, even though they may not feel it directly, somewhat obligated to comply with the wishes of the funders. And there's a good book that says, the revolution will not be funded. If you are proposing a radical solution that would redistribute power away from this handful of people that maintain all of the power, they're not going to fund you. So if we have a general understanding that the issues in the world are these issues of domination that are exerted by corporate interests, transnational global capital interests largely, who are operating like even beyond a national context, that's where the power is, and anything that threatens that power will be cut off. So there's this idea that through grants and things, you can sort of have the cardboard check, glittery gala, feel good, pat on the back, doing good work. But the reality is that many of these companies are making profits off of the misery of the global populace. And if we actually redistributed resources in a way to ameliorate poverty, their businesses would be harmed. So we've got sort of these global poverty management complexes that are run through well-meaning, often nonprofits, but are limited by the fact that they're funded by entities that have no real desire for poverty and immiseration to end. I mean, also Bill Gates is funding like GMO seeds. Like he's funding the privatization of public education. There are many elements of these policies that might be something that one individual person feels is good for everyone else, but many people realize it's a huge problem. So again, that's one person who's exerting disproportionate influence over the lives of millions of people. And it's very hard to, we didn't elect Bill Gates to anything. We didn't. And there's no way to get at Bill Gates or at Eric Schmidt or at New America or at these think tanks. There's no way to get at them because at this point, and I don't know, it goes back very far in terms of influence, but the government is operating with these partners in sort of shadowy back corners in a way that the general public will never get to. We'll never get those invitations to Davos. We'll never know. We're not meant to know what goes on there. And those aren't people we can elect out.
So what's interesting about this is people that I know who are all about democracy and representation and government and government by the people. The idea of government, not necessarily the actual reality of it, are also the same people that support Bill Gates and these. They're benevolent and as a force of good, and there's a disconnect there because on one hand, they're cheerleading the idea of a democracy while celebrating this incredibly undemocratic setup, arrangement.
I mean, for me, like I said, my entry point was in through the public schools, and I could see the grave harm that was being done. And I mean, I give Bill Gates credit. He actually has all of his grants on his website, right? So you can go in different project areas, look and see the hundreds of millions of dollars going into all sorts of things. Now, my scope up until recently wasn't looking at their global health initiatives, right? Like I was looking at schools, which was big enough. It was a huge, and even like trying to scratch the surface of global health and vaccine programs and other things, there's just whole other elements that open up. But money is power, and that money and power is very concentrated. So I would say if you go to any of the major foundations and you start to peel back where their grants are from, you can see how they can control things. Hewlett-Packard is an entity that very few people, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, it's not really one of those top ones that you hear, pointed out. But they're very influential. Essentially, they have restructured the nonprofit industry to be data-driven, to run these human capital markets that are coming. And so I spent a good